Even though Sophie was a teacher, she hated her pupils. She knew being a teacher was a noble profession, mainly because everybody told her it was a noble profession. And the reason she stayed was mainly because she'd managed to link the idea that she was noble to her own sense of self-worth. So even though she hated children, hated the building, hated the smell of the crumbling concrete, the fluorescent lighting and the ancient bell that called everyone to lesson like a depressing death knell, she stayed. So it wasn't for the love of the job that she'd gone into school early that day. She'd gone to school early because this was the only time that it could be guaranteed that she could get the lump out of school and into her car without anybody noticing. She first discovered the lump during a free period the day before. She was looking in the back of the cupboard underneath some discarded books. She was hoping to find a first edition Harry Potter or lesser, a hardback she could wrap up as a birthday present for a relative. That's when she first saw the lump. There could be no other word for it. Sat there, behind a box of Animal Farms. The second thing she noticed was the smell. School normally had a smell of hormones, amyl nitrate and Lynx Africa. But this was a lovely, sumptuous vanilla smell. Not the sickly smell of an ice cream flavoured vape, nor the headache-inducing smell of an Aldi candle. This was different, like a deep smell of amber, vanilla and something else. She stared at it, the lump, and it glowed. A glow that made you think of something you'd seen in a style magazine, sat in the background of a photo of some European artist's house. She was drawn to it. Whatever it was, she knew she had to take it home. But she realised rather quickly that it was not something she could remove from the school grounds without anybody noticing. So she scraped her slightly grown-out manicured nails through her expensive balayage and tied it up in a messy bun and thought hard. She paced round her messy classroom whilst Girls Aloud sang sounds of the underground through her Bluetooth speaker. And then she realised what she had to do. She had to come into school early, before first bell, and so she did, and smuggled the lump into her rather shabby Skoda Fabia. Her first lesson was with Year 9. She could smell them before she could see them, hormones and bubblegum vape fumes. They fell into the classroom like a tipped-up tin of angry baked beans. And of course, bringing up the rear was Jonathan, the potato. Everyone in the staff room called Jonathan the potato. Even that was cruel to potatoes. At least potatoes could be chips or patatas bravas. He entered the room with his usual phlegmy cough greeting, accompanied by a fart fanfare, and trudged to the back of the class to take up residence at his desk. Jonathan would always interrupt every 5 minutes with his grating catchphrases. I haven't got a pen. I need toilet. I've lost me paper. My hands smell of brown sticky. Later, as she drove home, all she could think about was getting the lump home and placing it in a spot in the living room that looked amazing and taking a perfect picture for Instagram. A perfectly poised photo of her with a glass of wine and her new acquisition, the lump. Her 200 followers on @VintageInteriors69dude account would be so jealous. She could see Homestyle magazine calling her and doing a feature. She wouldn't even caption it, just put 3 emojis to seem mysterious, like a glass of wine, a smile with a hint of smog, and a random animal like a snake. Perfect. Once she arrived home, she opened the door, tripped over her HelloFresh box and stumbled into her living room, where she dumped the homework that needed marking on the sofa and lovingly placed the lump on the coffee table. As soon as she put the lump on the table, the room was full of that rich smell, and the glow that came from it seemed to fill the room. She opened a bottle of wine, poured a glass, and ordered a takeaway, ignoring the HelloFresh box and the 30 short stories titled What I Did on My Holidays that needed marking. By the time she'd finished off the bottle of Sauvignon Blanc, opened another one, eaten the Cambodian/Greek fusion noodles, and had a good cry over the repair shop, she resolved to do the marking at lunchtime tomorrow and stumbled to bed. The next morning, she grabbed the books and rushed out, taking a quick glance at the lump. Had it grown? No. It was probably the fat eyes she gets when hungover. Once at her classroom, she looked at the pile of unmarked homework and noticed green pen all over it. Had she marked it last night? After she'd finished the second bottle? Had she marked them drunk? She'd done that once before and it had gone horribly wrong, mainly because she'd called the head girl a specky four-eyed gangly suckhole in the notes in the margin. In her defence, the head girl was a specky four-eyed gangly suckhole, but that didn't make the subsequent parents' evening any easier. She looked at the green writing all over the stories and noticed that it all made sense, that actually it was quite in depth and that the constructive criticism sounded, well, good, and in fact neater than she would normally do them. She thought nothing more of it and congratulated herself on her swift work and neat drunken handwriting, telling herself that she should probably mark drunk more often. She was ecstatic. Drunk Sophie was doing her proud. This feeling lasted about 10 minutes until her good mood was shattered by the arrival of Jonathan, the potato. He wandered aimlessly into the room and then expelled gas simultaneously from both orifices like a smelly grenade of attitude. After the 5th time of trying to answer the question, "Why are we doing poetry? It's pointless and boring," the bell rang and everyone ran off to try and beat the crowds into the dining hall. She packed up her books and trundled to the staff room. Just as she was halfway through eating last night's leftover noodles and scrolling through Instagram to see who'd liked her new post, she was given some rather unfortunate news. Ofsted would be observing her class in a few days. And not just any class. They would be observing her Year 9 English Literature class. The class with Jonathan in it. She felt sick. What was she going to do? She couldn't afford to have another black mark by her name. She needed this job. Why couldn't they observe her Year 8 class? They loved colouring in. Job done. No, they had to observe Year 9. Year 9 with their smells and their problems and Jonathan. The rest of the day went by in a panicked haze until she got home that night. She opened the door, tripped over the usual box, made a mental note to cancel her HelloFresh subscription and went straight to the living room to bathe in the glow of the lump and think about how she was going to solve the Jonathan problem. But when she got into the living room, she realised the lump seemed to have moved. It seemed to have grown slightly and changed shape. But then she told herself off. That she was being silly, and she's probably just hungover. Ornaments don't just grow and change shape and move on their own. Maybe she's just been watching too much Uncanny and spooked herself out. She sat down and got out the Year 9 homework and classroom seating plan to see how she might be able to move Jonathan to a better place in the classroom, like the playing field. The next morning, she shuffled downstairs, took a quick look at the lump for reassurance, bundled her bags into the Skoda Fabia before hurrying to school for a day of Ofsted planning. She went into her bag with trepidation, remembering the lesson plan she'd forgotten to do and the marking for the Year 10 mock exam she'd promised to review when she noticed the familiar green pen all over them. Was she having a breakdown? A really productive breakdown? Her auntie had a breakdown at Sophie's age, but that manifested in her eating only cheese for 6 months and not getting out of her nightie. At school, the other teachers talked nervously about the Ofsted visit. She still had no clue how she was going to trick the Ofsted people into thinking she was a good teacher. She needed a plan, a diversion, a box with air holes in to hide Jonathan in. Her next class was with her Year 9s, and she decided to give them an inspirational speech, to build them up before the next lesson, to warn them to behave. She was mainly aiming this at Jonathan, but he wasn't there. And then Jonathan came into the classroom. But Jonathan was looking a little smaller today, less jaggy. His edges were not quite as well defined. He seemed to shuffle rather than stomp with his usual energy. He was somewhat diminished. She took this as a good sign and carried on with her speech. The lesson went without much fuss, and so she set her mind to the next day. She arrived home, stepped over the HelloFresh box, went to the kitchen for her wine, and then to the living room to look at the lump for inspiration for the night. 3 bottles later, she still had no inspiration from this strange and fascinating object and decided to pass out in a drunken stupor. The morning woke her up with the sound of the bins outside. She was still on the sofa, and the lump had disappeared. She searched frantically for it, but it had vanished. She felt sick. The room smelt of stale wine and bendy bin vegetables. Maybe she'd moved it in a drunken tidy mode. Was this just stress about Ofsted? Ofsted! She didn't have time to worry about a silly disappearing lump. She had a day of teaching to get to, and Ofsted. The day went by in a flash until the lesson came, the Ofsted lesson. Sophie entered the classroom. Her heart was pounding with trepidation, her head pounding with white wine to find the Ofsted inspector already there. Sat there in the empty classroom, looking like something between a clothes peg and Myra Hindley. She tried to smile, but she just burped instead and went to start writing on the board. She heard the class approaching, running down the hall like a herd of geese with Tourette's. She winced at the scraping chairs and looked out, expecting to see the sea of disappointment and noise as usual. But nothing. Just calm. And then she noticed it. Jonathan. He was sat still in his seat, his shirt pressed and white, not chewing gum grey. His hair neat, smiling. And was he glowing? And then there was the smell of vanilla. A warm hum of sweetness filled the class. She turned to the board to start her lesson with nerves still in her stomach, but the lesson went without a hitch. Jonathan, well, if it was actually Jonathan, was putting up his hand answering questions. No burps, no noises, no interruptions. How had she done it? Sailed through so easily. The Ofsted lady made notes, smiled approvingly, and when the bell went, the students filed out in silence, without a word. The clothes peg Ofsted lady left with a smile, and Sophie stood in her empty classroom feeling sick. She should be feeling fabulous. The lesson had gone well, but she felt a shift. Something was wrong. She began to pack up slowly, and as she popped the textbooks back in the cupboard, she saw something hidden underneath the books. She saw a lump. The smell of vanilla had left the room, and she sensed a vague whiff of fart. She looked at the lump and saw that it looked a bit like a potato. She looked more closely and saw that it had a face,